Welcome! Where are we? I'll tell you exactly where we are. We're at the 17th episode of the Talent Intelligence Collective podcast. That's where. That's 2 for 2 this year so far. We're very proud of ourselves. In this one, me, Alan Walker, Alison Ettridge and Toby Culshaw co-hosted an episode where we spoke to Hallie Bregman of Cuup. I don't want to give too much away about this episode other than to say that if you want to hear from an ex-data scientist who really understands the power of analytics and how combining talent intelligence with people analytics can bring amazing results, then listen on. This episode was so good that Alison was tapping Hallie up to be on another show in the not too distant future. Get listening, get learning, and stay intelligent, folks. Have fun! Before we get on with the main event, I just wanted to remind you that this podcast is proudly sponsored by our friends at Stratagens, and here's a very well-spoken chap to tell you a little bit more about them.
Stratagens gives HR leaders the data they need to transform businesses with the speed and ease required in today's world. If you're ready to make decisions that aren't lengthy, costly, one-dimensional, or based on gut feeling, visit stratagens.com. That's stratagens.com to register for a Wednesday demo drop-in and find out more.
Hello, I'm Alan Walker and welcome to episode number 17 of the Talent Intelligence Collective podcast.
Yay!
We're finally back into our regular monthly cadence after being quite frank, having a bit of a good old holiday at the end of 2021. But anyhow, I'm joined by my co-host Alice Ettridge of Talent Tuition and Toby Culshaw of Amazon. Say hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello, guys.
Unfortunately, no Nick Brooks again today. He's skiving. He's promised he'll be back for the next episode. We shall see. And who else do we have with us? Who's our wonderful guest this month? Which awe-inspiring talent intelligence leader do we have speaking to our motley crew today? It's Hallie Bregman. Hallie, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. Can you give us a quick intro, please? Who you are, what you do, and maybe some of the companies that you've done it for?
Absolutely. So, Hallie Bregman, I am currently VP of People at Cuup, which is a women's intimates consumer brand. I have previously led the global people analytics teams at PTC, which is a technology company, software technology global, and as well as at Wayfair and Toast. So big passion for data. My background is actually in data science. So started on the consumer and product side of things, marketing, before making my way to the HR space, but kind of fell in love with it. And so love telling stories about people with data.
Excellent. Fabulous. Thank you. It's lovely to finally have you on the show. It feels like we've been trying to make this happen for months.
I'm glad we could arrange it.
Exactly. Me and my co-hosts and our listeners, of course, are really looking forward to hearing more about you and your work. And just for the uninitiated into the show, including yourself, Hallie, because I believe you're a newbie, in just a minute, as per every other show we've done, Toby's going to guide us through some of the more thought-inducing hot topics from around the world of talent intelligence and people, and we'll all get involved in a discussion around those. And then Alison will be slightly supported by me and Toby, but we'll take the lead on firing questions at Hallie about her views on talent intelligence, people analytics, anything else she feels we need to know about. So, Toby, let's do this thing. You're up first. What's happening?
Well, some things never change. It's a bit like Groundhog Day, really, isn't it? One of the top things at the moment, there was an article around US workers and whether they're going to return to the labour market and the impact it's having, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. End of last year, almost 11 million unfilled openings. Unemployment rate is just 3.9%. So big labour scarcity and wages are increasing and pushing things up. Interesting, though, that the biggest reason essentially for this labour scarcity isn't skills, which we often immediately go to in that sort of skills gap. In the US, the Census Bureau is saying that it's about nearly 9 million, 8.8 million people are not working because they're caring for people with COVID or have had symptoms themselves. So I think that's an interesting factor to take into play, in that there is a a big shortfall in terms of workers at the moment, but this isn't necessarily a permanent piece in the US, and it could be something that flips or changes as we move forward.
That's really interesting. The numbers are startling, aren't they? In fact, they're so high. You'd have thought, like you say, eventually it's going to tail off. Those that are off because they're either sick or supporting the sick, eventually you'd like to think that will rectify itself. And I guess there's a proportion of people who just have decided that they quite enjoy not going to work after a couple of years of having no choice. So it's really interesting.
I think it's the burnout piece. I'm surprised they didn't mention that more. I think this idea of a selective sabbatical, people are taking advantage in a way that they never have before. And I'm not sure that's going to tail off as much.
I'm tempted to agree. And I think there's probably knock-on effects also where the people that haven't slowed down during the whole COVID period, haven't been on furlough, etc. I think there's a burnout period there where people are saying, well, actually, do you know what? I'm kind of done. I've been working kind of double bubble for the last year, 2 years. I need a break. And so, yeah, I think there's lots of factors at play all at the same time on this stuff.
I guess, because they'll probably see that it's their turn now to have some time off. And I guess you've also got, where you've got couples, maybe if one half of the couple is suddenly earning a lot more than they used to, the other person might not need to go back to work either. There's that to take into account.
Yeah.
This, I think, is where I sound like Groundhog Day, like really Groundhog Day. I think every podcast for the last 6, I've said, it's too early to say. But we do, don't we? Because we need to have a look at trend lines, right? Yeah. So we're talking about people taking sabbaticals, but you can't take a sabbatical forever because you've still got a mortgage to pay, right? Right? And you can't go, you know what, it's burnout, but I can afford to take 6 months out. But because you can't afford to take 18 months out unless you completely and utterly change your lifestyle, and sell your house and up sticks. And I think, it's too early for us to say. There's just too much at play. What we do know is that there's still 11 million unfilled openings, right? And if you just took the people who are taking a break, or you took the people who are caring for people that are sick, it doesn't count to 11 million. So we're still living in a world where labour is scarce for whatever reason, and therefore we're still living in a world where people are finding it hard to hire.
What's the solution to all of this? Nobody has one. No. Or if any of us had one, we'd all be very, very wealthy.
I think one of them is a sabbatical as a benefit, right? Let's stop losing talent to sabbaticals and actually give them out ourselves. I think in the long term, that's going to be a retention mechanism, and even if it's a little bit costly in the short term, I think it's worth it. But I think we'll see a trend towards that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So I think there are. The solution kind of is so complex that there's all sorts of different elements, right? So part of that solution is being proactive and having data and analytics at your fingers so that you can start to not look at what's staring in front of you as an organization, but that you can look beyond that and then proactively manage against that risk. So strategic workforce planning at a proper level, I think, will become less of something that's talked about and more of something that's actioned with data to back it up. And then I think what we'll see, and this is really relating to Hallie's point, is the 11 million unfilled openings that are there. It would be a really interesting piece of analysis to say, well, how many of those haven't allowed for the fact that the candidate market has moved on slightly and want things like sabbaticals and want things like flexible working and want things like a different location. Because if the vast majority of those openings are still insisting on something other than that, then clearly that's going to have an impact on the number of people that are applying and whether or not labour is scarce. So, there's a long-term, how do we be proactive and properly workforce plan, which lots of organisations have talked about for years and not many have done in reality beyond 12 months, versus then everybody catching up with what we think candidates may or may not want over the course of time.
Do you think anybody will ever go back to long-term workforce planning, Alison?
I think they'll have to. I don't think they've got a choice, actually. But you say ever go back to? I don't think anybody really ever went there. In terms of long term, the businesses that we talk to, at best, are working on 3-year cycles. And they might have something 5 years or 10 years out, but the world is so disrupted that actually going out beyond that is quite hard.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said the word back. I probably should. Will they ever go to long-term workforce planning? Because especially with things like what we're just coming to the end of now, in theory, pandemics. Well, I think there's no point planning any more than 2 or 3 years.
Well, and I think that 2 or 3 years is actually quite meaningful in that, like, it's impossible to set something in stone that's not going to change, but to have a framework and something a little bit higher level, as opposed to getting as granular as, I think on 6-month cycles might get. I do think it's important to kind of have that philosophy and that idea of where skills are going and where you're going to lean into. And when it comes to career pathing, right, giving folks a 6-month career path is not very effective. I think you have to have that longer term vision to say, well, this is where we're going to grow into. And this is where we want to, build skills within our organization so we can staff that down the road.
Yeah, you're right. A 6-month career path's a bit crap, isn't it? Because it's like in 6 months' time, you'll be doing pretty much the same job that you're doing right now.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not very inspiring.
But there's 2 really interesting points in that. So the first is that I don't think many companies are doing it properly out to 3 years. So actually, I think that's the first shift that we'll see, is that companies are not looking at what's in front of us for this year. The majority of organisations are still saying, what's our hiring plan for the next year? And not how is our workforce shape going to change over the next 3 years.
That's right.
So that's a fundamental shift anyway in terms of what people are doing. And then I think to Hallie's point, which is, I'm going to love talking to you, Hallie, it's just so exciting. But to Hallie's point, there's this bit about skills and trends and insights and predicting. And that plays much more actually into the talent intelligence space. And that's not necessarily what's our workforce plan going to be, but it's what's the stuff that's coming and going to hit us on the horizon. That as we get closer to it, we need to start building into our workforce plan. So you've got to have both lenses. You've got to have this longer term lens of what's likely to come around the corner, but you can't plan your workforce for what's going to be around the corner because you'll get hit by lots of things. But you can plan your workforce for 3 years out.
Do you think there's going to be a pushback, just thinking about that kind of strategic workforce planning piece and kind of tying that into the salary increases and stuff we mentioned earlier? I can't help but feel there's going to be a pushback from finance once kind of this initial wave of panic hiring / just hire whoever we can for the money because we need to get the work done type piece has gone through. Finance saying, well, that was great. We've all had fun while it lasted. Time to rebalance the books. And I can't see any solution beyond a fair chunk of the work heading towards lower cost areas and lower cost countries, and kind of a rebalancing once again, and then salaries maybe taking a bit of a dip again. What are your thoughts? Am I wrong? I probably am.
I don't think you should ever say that because you're normally right, Toby. But no, I'm with you, right? But I think that one of the things that is fundamentally different across organisations today is that, flippantly, organisations used to put people are our greatest asset somewhere in their annual report, right? And some of them meant it, and some of them kind of it was an observation rather than something that was then acted on. I think what the last 2 years has done is made people realise how important that is, particularly in certain sectors, right? And so rather than people just being a cost on a balance sheet that your CFO is going to look at, I think they're going to say, okay, so now what we need to do is we need to think more holistically. We can no longer look through the salaries lens. We need to look at total cost of ownership. And that's going to be the stuff that you and I have talked about, right, for some time, which is, do we spend more money on retaining people because actually the cost to replace or the cost of an empty seat has a much greater impact on our bottom line, or do we relocate to lower cost areas? But it still remains to be seen what the impact of that is on the quality of work and the quality of output. Or do we move to a model that incorporates those two? What I think will happen is that the CFO is going to look at this total cost of ownership in a way that hasn't been looked at before, and that's why it's more important than ever to kind of join the dots around labour, margin, productivity, retention, attrition, and what's happening in an organisation.
Well, shall we move on, Toby? It's another mover, because you've got 4 or 5 good pieces we could talk about.
Yeah, I probably won't get through them all. Let's be honest.
We never do.
Well, I'm going to skip the next one because I'm at the US SME market. Well, I'll talk about it quickly. Basically, they're all having to increase their salaries, unsurprisingly. Big report out. Half of US SMEs raised salaries in January due to the tightening labour market. Yeah, I think it's kind of what we expect. But the National Federation of Independent Businesses has done a big report into it and proving that it's impacting the entire labour force, not just the enterprise. But I think the more interesting article I'd like to talk into is it was a study done looking at the gender differences in the labour market and how it ties back to root child behaviour. So childhood behaviour, we often see kind of the gender wage gap and kind of look at it in the workforce element. But this recent study is from the US longitudinal survey. They dug into what were the childhood characteristics and behaviours and what were the longer term effects of those behaviours on the salary. Really interesting because there's some really fundamental stuff in there around characteristics for young boys and girls and the impact from a salary perspective later in life. Really interesting study, and there's some really core stuff in there that kind of raises some real questions around how do we do that? How do we manage this in life? How do we look at kind of the headstrong behaviours of men and women and as children, and how that's going to impact? So men makes no real significant economical difference. Women, if you're a headstrong child, it's got a huge impact later in life. It's fascinating.
Positively or negatively?
Negatively.
So if you're a headstrong female, it negatively impacts your earning potential or your annual earnings.
Correct.
Wow.
Exactly that. Which is kind of counterintuitive in some ways. It's an interesting one because it's kind of counterintuitive in some ways.
Exactly, I was going to say that. Yeah, you think somebody more assertive would be more diligent about negotiation, more forceful, etc. But it's almost the opposite.
I think this ties back to the 30% scenario, right? So if you've, and again, we're talking historically, but if you had 10 people around a table and one of them was a woman who was headstrong, right? And probably if there was only one who was around the table, they had needed to be in order to get there historically, then actually they were kind of seen as a gobby voice in the room. But actually, once you got to 30%, whether this is gender or whether it's minority, once you get to 30%, the views converge, then actually you start to think of it as an opinion across the whole table and much less character driven or trend driven. So I think this is interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. There's kind of this, oh my God, help us. But actually, I think in the longer term, we'll see a swing in this where we're beginning to tie the socio-emotional behaviours of kids to leadership skills. And I think that's where we need to get to. So I think the data looks at, I think I'm right in saying kind of 1979 onwards. And then it looks at adults who are still reasonably young in the workforce, I think. So it'll be interesting to see how it changes as boards and leadership teams change.
Alison, I think you're spot on because this is retrospective, right? The culture, the societal norms were so different. And like when a little girl was headstrong, she was called bossy, right? That was the norm. Now I've got a almost 5-year-old little girl who I never call bossy. I tell her she has great leadership skills, right? And so, and I think that's kind of the culture shift. And so by the time the daughters of today grow up, I expect that we no longer have the only situation where women are the only one at the boardroom. You know, they're one of 10. I think there will very much be, a swing where whether it is more women or more underrepresented folks or more whoever, right? People who haven't always had a seat at the boardroom. I think that's what's going to change this so that it's not the same trend going forward.
Yeah, I so agree with you. But interestingly, there was another piece in the same article that looked at dependent behaviour. So it got headstrong behaviour, and then it looked at dependent behaviour as children. And in the males, so in the boys that had more dependent behaviour as children, that negatively impacted on them. Whereas in women, that positively impacted on them. So it's really interesting.
And that's something.
Sorry, you go, Hallie.
No, I think culturally that's something that hasn't changed as much, right? Like we focused on empowering women, but little boys who still want to play dress up are still told they're not manly. And I think there's, that I wouldn't be surprised to see that trend persist a little bit longer.
Yeah, I so agree with you.
All I was going to ask is what do they mean by dependent behaviour? Is that kind of neediness or anxiety, or how would it be defined?
Oh God!
I'd think about it as a follower, right? Somebody who isn't leading, they're following.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms, exactly that. So the way they define it in the article is children can score high on the dependent scale when their mother reports that he or she demands a lot of attention, clings to adults, cries too much, and is too dependent on others.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I should mention this work was done by Professor Keisner, a research professor, Harris School of Public Policy, University of Chicago, and Ofer Malamud, assistant professor of human development, social policy, Northwest University. And if I've said your names wrong, if you happen to be listening to this, Robert and Ofer, I apologize. Reach out to me on LinkedIn and tell me how to say it appropriately.
And you know what? If Hallie's little girl is listening to this in 10 years' time, and my little girl is listening to this in 10 years' time, for all the times that we've told you to stop being headstrong and stop having your own opinion, let's apologise. I hope you're living in a world where it fundamentally is different and it's seen as leadership traits.
I agree.
Right, one more bit of news then, Toby. What else is there?
Which one should we go for next? We've got an interesting article about the Great Resignation. The fact it just didn't happen, and it's been an over-baked idea, and it's just a plain wrong. Or we've got an interesting article on the Romanian Competition Council launching a labour market investigation.
Let's go for that one, because I think we've done the Great Resignation to death, haven't we? Yeah, just whether people are leaving or not leaving, there's still not enough people to leave to fill the jobs that are there. So yeah, we've kind of done that one to death.
I'm glad. I think so. We have it pretty much every time. I'm glad you think the same. So the Romanian Competition Council, the RCC, have launched its first ever investigation, and this time it's looking into potential antitrust competitive conduct by automotive companies in the labour market. So essentially,
you need to change the way you said that, because you said its first ever investigation. Its first ever investigation into the labour market and anti-competitive conduct, I suspect, is probably more true.
Yes, that's.
You don't know for definite, Alison.
No, I don't.
Be.
Could be either.
They're a very relaxed council who don't really care normally, but this one's got their go.
It may have been a very new creation. Maybe the council didn't exist before.
The power of the English language and tone. Sorry, Toby.
I didn't know where the bullet point or the appropriate punctuation was clearly on that. But the RCC, the Romanian Competition Council, they've launched this investigation, and it's essentially looking at whether a load of competing companies in the automotive industry in Romania have coordinated their actions for the purposes of sharing the market of qualified and specialist workers, essentially having no poaching tactics, and freezing remuneration levels. Which is interesting. I find that this sort of stuff, it's surprising it's still going on. There's obviously been a lot of very... Apologies, my bear dog is trying to escape and is now eating my door, which is nice.
Right, so I think there's something on here which is quite interesting, which is some of it's to do with the framing and the language, right? So there's no poaching tactics, which prevents companies hiring employees from the others, right? And whether that eliminates effective competition. Yeah, that's really interesting in a world where skills are converging and where we see companies partnering. So if I think about, so in the UK, if I think about driving the electric revolution, right, we know that there aren't enough PEMD skills in the UK, and therefore companies are going to have to partner and collaborate much more effectively, both across corporates and SMEs, in order to deliver what's needed, just full stop, in order to meet market demand. And actually, if you remove this kind of no poaching tactics, are you going to then reduce the collaboration across those organisations? And also, does it happen anyway? Sorry, Hallie, I'd love your views.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure I have a real perspective on this one.
Cool, no worries. It's the first time, isn't it? Right, so it's the first time that we've got this kind of no poaching tactics. If we think about what that means in reality in employment contracts, it really stands up in court anyway.
Yeah.
But I think the difference, what the RCC is looking at, which would be quite interesting, is whether or not that's therefore suppressing salaries and lower levels of remuneration, and is that why they're doing it? And I don't think it is. I think I think that might be an effect, but I don't think it's the causation. I think the causation is there aren't enough people, and we need to collaborate and partner together. But only time will tell.
Yeah, I do think about the phenomena of non-competes that have right, this kind of the flip side almost, right? You can't leave to go to a competitor. Now you can't poach from your competitors. I think non-competes have started to peter out, at least here in the US. And I don't know that this would stand up.
No.
I think the difference for me, though, there's a big difference between saying no poaching, as in please don't go out and headhunt our staff, versus you're not allowed to recruit or hire our staff if they're wanting to apply for a job. For me, that's it may sound like a subtle difference, but I think that's a fundamental difference. One of them says, look, just don't destroy our company. We're trying to both co-create or build here. Don't destroy each other. The other one is saying you're actively going to stop workers having a career progression and career development and opportunities. So for me, I think there's a fairly fundamental difference between the two.
There is, but I think sourcing is such a fundamental talent strategy these days, right? As we talk about things like inclusion and how we increase representation, it's right. Your inbound applicants are not largely who you hire. It is often a small proportion of who you hire relative to, I think I often hear this statistic, something like 1% of inbound applicants get hired. But of those who are sourced, right, it's a much higher conversion rate. And so I think it's basically taking away sourcing from a pool of people. I don't know that it works.
No, I'm with you. And I think the non-compete is just, whilst there is a subtle difference in the language, a non-compete clause in an employment contract rarely stands up because someone can argue that you're preventing them from having a career and career development, right? So, I think it's interesting that they're looking at it for the first time. But I think the outcome is, ultimately, if you stop it happening, you're going to prevent career development. You're, as you say, getting rid of sourcing. And I think you squash collaboration across organisations because the skills pool is not going to magically get bigger in other in other ways. So it'll be. I think it's one for us to watch, Toby, more than we can kind of comment on it now, but it'll be interesting to see what the results are more than anything else.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think the bit that I quite liked is the RCC also kind of said to other companies in other industries whether there is a specialised workforce and supply of staff is short to audit their own practices.
Yeah.
Because essentially it was kind of a, look, we've got this whistleblowing platform, we are going to push it, we're going to come. This is maybe the first ever, as we discussed earlier, but they're clearly ramping this up. It's something they really want to look into. So I think it's an interesting one.
And if the story behind it is that they're using it to squash wage inflation, right, then there's definitely something that needs to be done. But if the story behind it is how do we collaborate better and partner more effectively without disruption, then it's slightly different. So we have to wait and see what the results are and how it comes out, I think.
Well, hopefully one of our many listeners from the Romanian Competition Council can get in touch and give us their view on it. But anyway, listen, I think mindful of time, and I'm desperate to hear about Hallie and Hallie's wider world rather than chatting about the news. Alison, as our resident interviewer extraordinaire, it's time for you to step up. So I'm gonna hand the virtual mic over to you But if you do need me to pop in, I've got some questions I'd love to ask Hallie as well. So let me know.
Perfect. Well, jump in as we're talking. So, because I think that would just be, I think it'd be interesting to do that anyway. Hallie, it's great to meet you. And I loved looking at your background, right? Because I was thinking, oh, here we are. We've got somebody who's actually started their career in research that's not in our world, right? So, in its own right, that's really interesting. And then has kind of come in through a data lens, and now is in a people leadership role. I guess I'm just interested to understand what were the different motivators at each of those kind of junctures. So the move from research into data, the move from data into talent and talent analytics, and then from talent analytics to people leader. What were the kind of motivations and drivers?
Yeah. I was looking up icebreakers today for a conversation I'm having later today with another team, and there was one that was around like one word to describe yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think my one word is non-traditional, and I don't like doing things the way that everyone else does them, which I think is very much reflected in my career path. I got a PhD in clinical psychology because I loved research, and as I went through that program, I realized I really loved statistics, and I didn't really want to spend my time doing additional clinical hours and XYZ to take a traditional role that wasn't going to fulfill me. And so I happened to get lucky. It was really nascent days of data science, but I joined a startup, and I think that was also non-traditional at the time. It was early days in Boston. With the startup community wasn't nearly what it is today. But I joined this team where I got visibility into all parts of the business because we were a team of 10 people. And that kind of opened my eyes to where I could go. So when I then made the move into, marketing and product data science and eventually into people analytics, all of those just really built on this kind of broad perspective of how a business operates. And that is a really useful lens to have as a people leader. And so now I sit as VP of people. So kind of overseeing the whole shebang when it comes to our people, but understanding what happens in the marketing functions, understanding what happens in the product functions, understanding what happens in traditional HR, and bringing that all together and thinking about it with how do we spin this a little bit differently? How do we invest more in our people? How do we retain people? How do we try different things and be a little bit more innovative? I think that very much reflects what I'm passionate about and how my career has kind of set me up for this today.
And it's so interesting because I think that we talk quite a lot in Stratagens about joining the dots, and that kind of comes that ties into the conversation that you've just had, which is actually if you look through a marketing lens, or you look through a product lens, or you look through a wider business lens, what sits at the heart of lots of that is talent and people, and yet historically we've kind of used data in each of the different functions, but we haven't kind of brought it all together or brought best practice into people and talent.
Exactly.
What was the one thing that surprised you when you kind of first came from the world of particularly consumer and data science and into people analytics? What was the one thing that kind of made you go, oh my God, why didn't you do that?
How manual people were doing reporting. I couldn't believe the lack of automation coming from a world where it was just common to have, SQL servers and scripts and automate. Like it wasn't there, and it's creeping there, right? I think we've got a lot of technology that's come out over the last 5 years. But when I first stepped in, I was like, why are you waiting for that Excel pivot table to refresh for 10 minutes? I'm not sure that's good for anybody. You're bored, right? It's not good for the process. It's not repeatable. It's not automatable. And so how do we take our best practices and at the time was at a company that was incredibly data driven and had really robust pipelines and tech stacks on the consumer side. And so it was just eye-opening to realize how underinvested and kind of, I don't want to say behind, but just like how no one had even thought to take this lens and bring it to the people space. So I've been so encouraged to see people analytics evolve and become prioritized. And if nothing else good came out of the pandemic, it was this elevation of people and the need to use people data and talent intelligence to really drive a business.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, right? So we had my background is research, but it's always been in talent intelligence and consulting, and
Yeah.
we had almost exactly this conversation earlier this week, which is strategies as a platform, right, is repeatable. It's if you run a search, you do it the way you want it to. But we've been delivering some bespoke projects, and we had this conversation about this is still pretty manual, and we're not in Excel days,
Yeah.
right? But how do
Yep.
we make this
Yep.
repeatable? How do we make this something that anybody could pick up the phone and these are the things? And in fact, there was some talk on the collective, Toby, about it was actually about how things are priced, but it was how do you price something to your internal audience based on a number of different categories? And that's the same concept, isn't it? That's the concept that says this should be a repeatable process that we can productize in some way, shape, or form. And I don't think it's completely gone away from either the people analytics world or the talent intelligence world.
No, I think back to kind of my early days in people analytics, and I used to say, well, like, we're not really into productizing things, right? We don't really need to write scripts. Like, we're just doing analysis, right? And today I'd say the opposite. I'd say, like, we still need to do that custom analysis, but more than ever, we need things productized. We need it at our fingertips, and we need to be able to, make moving quickly and agilely, and not take months and months doing a research study.
Yeah, absolutely. Because speed is of the essence right now, isn't it? That's particularly in today's world. That's how businesses they're being disrupted so quickly that they need to make decisions quickly.
Exactly.
And that kind of lends itself then into how do you make data meaningful to business leaders. And I'm interested to hear, because you made this step from data analytics and data science much more into data analytics.
Yep.
What do you think were the kind of key learnings in terms of presenting data in a way that actually it was business intelligence rather than data?
Number one is data literacy, which is something that more and more folks have in the business. I think depending on what part of the business folks work in, but in some of these giant tech companies and on the consumer side of things, data is very much a part of the way folks work. They think about marketing metrics, they think about operations, time to delivery, whatever it is, right? And so giving them metrics for people is not so out of their element. I think it's understanding, taking where we haven't yet connected the dots well is back to dollars, right? And I think this is the thing that the problem a lot of folks are trying to solve. And I think sometimes connecting it back to dollars would be brilliant and helpful. And other times it's helping folks come on the journey to understand that people are valuable, even if you can't connect 1 minute of their time back to dollars. But I think it's getting beyond the metrics and the stories we are used to telling as a field. This amount of turnover, this is the reasons people are leaving, or this is our efficiency model for recruiting. How many people can a recruiter, actually recruit for in a particular time period? Those are kind of some of the basics, but I think it's actually starting to use the business metrics to think about productivity. I think that will be one of the pieces that helps connect the dots. And for instance, if I think about engineering, right, this is harder to do in some functions than others, but my dream has always been to take engineering data, so Git commits, Jira tickets, right, lines of code submitted, whatever it might be, and turn that into objective productivity metrics, which you can then tie back to things like comp decisions, merit, promotions, again, evaluations. Before we all got on this call, we were talking about performance reviews and calibrations, right? Those are very very subjective conversations today. And I think as we take more of that business data, those marketing metrics, those engineering, right, like, and pull it all back together, I think that will help tie the story back to business leaders.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. We're going through a valuation exercise as a business right at the moment, and historically there are kind of revenue metrics, right, and multiples of revenue. But actually, we're working with a business at the moment that's looking particularly at things like, well, how many lines of code have you got, and how big is your data lake? Because that's the stuff that really matters, because that's the barriers to somebody coming in, and it's getting to a much more detailed, quantifiable number than
exactly
just your top line, right, or your bottom line, whichever it might be. And then
exactly.
I think the second bit that I think is really interesting that you were talking about then was the business metrics around, whether it's attrition or whether it's retention, that ties into the conversation we were having in the news section around this total cost of ownership piece for me, which is, if you can look at the cost of an empty seat,
Right.
and look at that and go, oh my goodness, that is the impact on our bottom line. That starts to drive investment in people in a completely different way and completely different metrics to how long is it going to take us to hire, and have we, and how many people are you bringing in through your ATS system? It's a
Right. And that's
Yeah.
exactly. And that's the kind of thing I think we've talked about, like, oh, I need headcount because we will get, more work done, right? But it's quantifying that in a way that actually makes us be able to say, like, we will close 50 less tickets this month if our attrition stays as high as it is, right?
Yes.
And that 50 tickets will then be impacted downstream because of XYZ, right? Like it's those conversations that will pull it all back together. So I think we as people analytics and talent intelligence practitioners have still mostly stayed in the people realm of things. And I think bringing it all back together is going to be when we get really, really impactful.
And was that one of the things that drove you particularly to join Cuup and take, which is a very cool business, incidentally, but to take this kind of broader role that says, let's have a look at just other stuff that's going on?
Yeah, I think it's that holistic perspective and also the ability to actually drive change. So I think oftentimes people analytics leadership, the job is to tell the story, right? The job is to, share the insights, but it's not to make the decisions. And I think oftentimes people analytics practitioners, and we've talked about this for years, are some of the most well-positioned to actually, excuse me, drive the action, right? They've been in the data, they've been in the weeds, they understand the phenomena. And oftentimes the translation layer going from here's the story to the person who actually makes the decision, right? There's a bit of a gap there. And so for me, it was about being able to see the big picture, know the insights, know the data, but most importantly, be able to actually action upon it myself, and kind of drive that strategy beyond just the input to the strategy. So it was, an exciting pivot for me. And I think it's one we're going to see more and more often.
Yeah, I think it's I hope it's one we see more often, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's two questions that I'm conscious of time, so I need to make sure I get these two questions in particular. So the second is around DEI, but the first I think is linked to this kind of VP people role. What would your advice be to a CHRO who's really looking at bringing data to the table? From the outset, would you advise them to start with people analytics, or would you advise them to start with what the other functions are doing in terms of data and how that could be applied to people?
I'd advise them to start with people analytics. I think kind of getting, knowing the inside of your own function is the first step, right? If you are going to kind of outreach, you've got to clean your house first. And so I think knowing that really, really well, being able to know it inside and out, is certainly where you go. But the opposite, so I think we talk a lot about should the CHRO bring in, but I think often it's what should the rest of the leadership, the CEO, the COO, look for when they're bringing in people leadership, and at what size and at what scale. Because one of the things that I found in so Cuup is a 50-person company, right? I've come from global thousands and thousands and thousands of people to a very small company. One of the things that I found is a lot of folks at this size and scale, don't know what people analytics is. We've kind of taken for granted that talent intelligence has become such a phenomena in the larger corporate setting, but helping the future companies understand that talent intelligence is going to be critical to their long-term growth and success. I think that's kind of the other flip side I would take to this.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I thought you were going to say the opposite. Actually, I thought you would say start with business data, but this concept of clean your own house first is interesting as the CHRO. But actually, there's a much broader, wider picture, isn't there? Which is to a CEO or to the SLT, if you're bringing somebody in to look at this function, don't just, in inverted commas, bring in someone who's good at people. Bring in someone who's good at data,
right?
And then people, right? Because actually, data is what's going to drive us.
Exactly. It's the CEO mindset, right? Not too many CEOs went up on a career ladder and got to the top, right? They often have rotated throughout the business, not often in HR, but they've often rotated throughout the business. And I think, the thing beyond people analytics leaders moving into CHRO roles, I think we'll start to see CHRO roles move into the CEO roles, as we have with Lena Nair from Unilever moving to be CEO of Chanel, for instance.
Yeah, which is just such a great move.
Yeah.
Some of the most successful consumer goods companies, right, have done this for years, where they've moved
Yep.
people from finance to sales to marketing to product, but actually rarely then into people, right? So you're
Exactly.
This move around and understanding the importance of people would be a really interesting trend to track. And then the question that I must ask you is linked to DEI. One of the things that drives me bananas when we're talking to clients is that they're setting quotas or targets or ambitions around their diversities, whether this is gender or minority or less represented groups. And the number of times we go, right, okay, and what are you basing that decision on? And there's no data behind it at all. And you kind of go, right, okay. So if you're setting yourself, and I make it up now, but if you're setting yourself a target of 30% by 2030 because it sounds good, you're going to miss your target. So how do you use data? Can you give us examples of how you've used data to drive DEI?
Yeah. So, I mean, setting targets and representation is one of the most frustrating things to me, right? There are so many interesting and nuanced ways to use data to help inclusion and belonging in the workforce. Everybody focuses on representation. I went to one company where they had publicly stated we were going to have, something like 18% underrepresented people of color in the company within a 5-year span. And I very easily went and pulled up some benchmark companies. I pulled up, the representation stats for the census for the region this was in. And I was like, great, the companies that are winning all the awards in this space are at 12%, right? The representation in the city is below that, right? So is below 18%, right? So this big fancy number, and it was shared, and it was like, how did you even come up with that? It's impossible, right? It's literally impossible. It's therefore setting you up to fail. And instead of focusing on that, how about look at the fact that we're losing people of color at a much higher rate than we are white people, right? So maybe that's the metric you should be focusing on instead of creating some arbitrary target. I often say when people, hold my hand to the fire and say, what's the target? What are we trying to reach? I say better. We're trying to reach better, right? There's no magic number, but let's start pulling the levers that actually get us there instead of just saying, well, we're going to bring in, 18% people of color. Not doable.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's something about this. I love this concept of we're trying to reach better. So we're bang smack in the middle of scenario modeling for some clients now. I'm wondering whether I just go, you know what, just reach better. They might challenge me a bit on it, but it plays into exactly what you were talking about. Is that for me, DEI is the one area where you have got to bring internal and external data together to have a meaningful conversation.
Have to.
Because you need to look at, right, so we talk a lot about hiring to match the market, right? So if you're hiring to match the market, that's one way of you turning a dial. There is absolutely no point in trying to hire above market, because if the people aren't there, you're just going to leave your hiring managers going, well, I can't hire people, right? But then you've got to look at attrition, and are we losing more people who are minorities or non-minorities, and how do we influence that? And promotion data. Are we not promoting minorities above non-minorities? And so it's a holistic view, isn't it?
It's totally holistic.
I wonder whether that starts to, whether DEI is really the catalyst for this bringing together internal and external data. And as my final question, I wonder whether you can see one other fundamental area where you're saying, actually, DE&I, internal and external, real power. Is there another area that you're thinking in terms of people? If we could combine internal and external data, it's game changing.
Skills. Easy. right? I mean, it's the buzzword of the year for sure, of the last 2 years in this space, but no doubt it is external market, it's demand, it's supply, and it's internal. What do you have and where are the gaps and how are you going to get from A to Z?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. As an answer, that's fantastic. And Alan, that probably, if I'm behaving myself, because you told me I'd got a deadline.
No, I think we've all got a deadline. So I had questions, but I think you kind of covered most of them off anyway, Alison. So thank you. I'm going to call time, guys. I'm going to call a stop. We need to release our guests back into the wild. Hallie, it's been great having you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on the show. How was it for you?
Thank you so much for having me. I love these conversations. I think it's always fun to think about these questions, and so really enjoyed it.
Great. We aim to please. And as to our listeners, the usual massive thanks for supporting us. Keep telling your friends about us, and if you aren't telling your friends about us, start telling your friends about us. And if you haven't got any friends, join the Talent Intelligence Collective Facebook group whilst Facebook still has users. You'll find a lot of like-minded people there. Anyway, stay intelligent, folks. Thank you. Bye.
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 Thanks for listening. Before you go, I wanted for the last time to remind you about our generous sponsor, Stratagens. Here's that posh chap again, telling you about their fabulous product.
Stratagens gives HR leaders the data they need to transform businesses with the speed and ease required in today's world. If you're ready to make decisions that aren't lengthy, costly, one-dimensional, or based on gut feeling, visit stratagens.com. That's stratagens.com to register for a Wednesday demo drop-in and find out more.